Hey, nerds. So, going to continue my series that I started recently on philosophical temperaments from Plato to Foucault by Peter Sloterdjik, who is a European philosopher who considers himself to be if I remember correctly, a Foucaultian and a Nietzschean, and he references Plato and Foucault and Nietzsche in here. So, of course, Foucault is my favorite 70s pervert post-structuralist philosopher, as some of you know. And Plato, of course, is a famous ancient Greek philosopher, and he has a very specific philosophical moral framework based on reason, basically. And Nietzsche, of course, is the famous 19th century existentialist who had like a psychotic break and ended up in a mental institution. And there are all sorts of interesting facts about not only his philosophy, but him, of course, as well. And so we're going to get into basically Sloterdjik talking about philosophy, reality, interpretation, and the symbolic order of things. So a lot of interesting topics. All right, so get into the paragraph here. Okay. And here we have a great example of the absent void of the real, i.e., the whole gap. That sounds dirty, right? The whole gap. The whole gap haunts, betrays, and at the same time reinforces the symbolic order. So the the real is the absent void. So reality is reality is a void, but the real is like a void that is absent, which is interesting, right? Because that's slightly philosophically different in terms of metaphysics, of course. And at the same time, it's the absent void of the real, but it also reinforces the symbolic order. Now, I would say that Sloterdjik doesn't even necessarily believe in a symbolic order, but he's probably mentioning that to critique that idea that Plato had in opposition to Nietzsche's basically critique of Plato's moral framework based on reason, right? That we can find objective reality based on reason. Okay, so the absent void of the real reinforces the symbolic order, which sounds weird, right? Sloterdjik reads the history of philosophy and even in the very nature of philosophy through the reality of this void and thereby redefines the term of philosophy itself. So reality is a void, and since that void opens up, we can fill it with a redefinition of philosophy. The reality of the void, the reality is a void. So when this void opens up, we can fit into there a more useful to Sloterdjik interpretation of reality, and that'll fill in the void. Okay, thereby redefines the terms of philosophy itself. Philosophy is not about finding out the quote-unquote facts of our fundamental reality, i.e. science. It's not about finding the scientific facts of reality. That's not what philosophy is. Philosophy is a separate domain from science. And you can have scientific facts, and we should believe in scientific facts because they're useful to believe in our world. There are countless examples. But that's not the same thing as philosophy. Philosophy is not scientific, right? It's philosophy philosophy is not used to find scientific facts. It's used to basically help us find moral frameworks for how we use to pick what experiments to run and how to interpret them and how to carry forward the results to try to replicate the study, that sort of thing, right? Philosophy is much more speculative, which I find and gets much more fascinating to me. But anyway, so philosophy is not about finding the facts of a fundamental reality like scientific facts, but rather is a process that, deploying a Nietzschean reversal, reveals the facts which become less and less significant. So Nietzsche's reversal, he's basically reversing the idea of facts, and he might also be talking about the eternal return, basically, that it's this idea kind of like in reincarnation, except you live the exact same life over and over again in the exact same way, not necessarily without even being aware that you're doing this over and over again. That reminds me of the huge spoiler alert, but the ending of the Dark Tower series by Stephen King. Anyway, so a Nietzschean reversal reveals facts which become less and less significant. So the more you unpack the relevant context of a fact, the less and less specific that so-called objective truth is, right? So like let's say like water is 2 parts hydrogen, 1 part oxygen. Well, like 2 parts versus 1 part, is it always exactly 2 parts versus 1 part? Is it sometimes 2.2 parts versus 1.3 parts, or 2.2 parts versus 0.8 parts, or you know 1.8 parts plus 1.3 parts, etc., like that? And what are hydrogen and oxygen? These have been scientifically discovered, right? And that doesn't mean they don't exist. We clearly breathe oxygen, but when we drink water and we need it to survive. But like the more you unpack the relevant context of these, the more that becomes less important fact, right? Like so if we're talking about water, for example, what is hydrogen and what is oxygen? We know we know that we need them, but do we know exactly what they are? Scientifically, I'm sure we can find an objective scientific description of both. They're elements on the periodic table, but humans invented the names for the elements in periodic table rather. However, we need to have names, but we invent the words for things based on our interpretations. So you see how we use our subjective interpretation of reality in order to define what we see as objectively true. It works, but basically we have a working understanding of reality. We don't actually have an objective scientific truth understanding of reality. But these scientific facts can be useful, but they don't even necessarily have to be objectively true. But that's why science and philosophy are separate realms to me, unless you're talking about philosophy of science. Okay, so the facts become less and less significant. At the end of the day, philosophy for Sloterdjik becomes an interpretation opened up for rival interpretations not determined by a singular transcendent cause, a theology of sovereignty or Platonism, but rather about the new possible worlds and creative truths and their constitutive values invented and reinvented by us. Welcome to philosophy's temperamental behavior. I love that last sentence. Welcome to philosophy's temperamental behavior. Philosophy, that's why you can oversimplify this paragraph to say that philosophy is a temperamental interpretation of reality, or I prefer the word insidious interpretation of reality because that sounds cooler. So yeah, let's unpack this last part though. Okay, so remember this void of reality opens up a space for a reinterpretation of the definition of philosophy. That's what he's calling back to here. An interpretation up for rivaling interpretations not determined by a singular transcendent cause, theology, sovereignty, or Platonism. So we can talk about transcendence. Basically, he's talking about Plato's transcendent realm of forms, this idea that there's a realm of the ideal perfect versions of things, like the ideal perfect version of a chair, and God is the ultimate example of a perfect transcendent being, that sort of thing. You can look at that as theological, or if you can talk about it for any object in reality, like chairs. Like I mentioned, plenty of philosophers have used that example. And so instead of having basically a transcendent Platonistic worldview, you can use the Nietzschean reversal to fill that void of reality with new interpretations of the definition of philosophy, new worlds and creative truths. So when we can create new truths, that doesn't mean we're changing objective reality. That means our interpretations allow us to create new supposedly objective reality through our subjective interpretations, right? So, rather about new possible worlds and creative truths and their constitutive values invented and reinvented by us, right? So we use philosophy to invent and reinvent the values that we use to decide what scientific experiments to perform and how to interpret them, and the tools we use, etc. What our mood is like on that particular day, how hungry we are, how that influences how we make these decisions, and anything, whether you're having a fight with someone, whether you're tired, anything like that, whether you're really happy, anything. So yeah, that's basically the point that this is basically the point that I keep coming back to over and over again, that many philosophers are talking about. It's not that reality is all relative, but it's that reality is pluralistic. And that's not an objective true statement. It just basic basically basically the many of these philosophers like Sloterdjik, Foucault, Nietzsche are basically saying that we invent and change our values, and we use those philosophical values to interpret our subjective interpretations of reality, and we use our subjective values and subjective interpretations of reality in order to determine so-called objective truths. So that's all. So basically, reality is fucking complex. Morality is complex. Reality is infinitely complex. And that's why all of these details are so fascinating, which is why philosophy itself is so fascinating. And it's like fun to, I mean, you could even say it's fun to wrestle with, like the Jordan Peterson. That's part of the main appeal of philosophy. Anyway, yeah. So this is how to Sloterdijk and Nietzsche and Foucault, and I totally fucking agree that philosophy is not only a temperamental interpretation of reality, philosophy is an insidious interpretation of reality.